Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to our series called The 9. And at this point, we're almost all the way through. In this series, we've been looking at how to live wisely. We've been looking at 9 key practices or best ways to live wisely. And we've been always referring to that passage or verse in Proverbs 4, verse 5 that says, get wisdom, develop good judgment. One of the things we've been saying all through this series, and I'm just going to say it just over and over again, is that wisdom is not something that you get naturally. It's not something that just, you wake up one day and you have it. You have to practice it. It's a skill that you have to learn. Wisdom is something that you have to develop within your thinking, within your mindset, within your attitudes, and within your behaviors. So today we've been, over these last number of weeks, we've been talking about how to live wisely. And I just want to review quickly the 7 ways we've learned so far of the 9. So far we've looked at dig it up, which is go inside yourself and invest in your dreams and gifts and talents that God has given you. Secondly, pull the tooth. Deal with the negative and hurtful actions and attitudes that you need to address, either within yourself or in your relationships with others. Thirdly, play the movie. Make decisions based on their effects. Play it out, the scenes of what the choice you make today and how it will affect you today, tomorrow, next month, next year, the next decade of your life. As well, do something. Number 4, move from passivity to proactivity. Improve the situation, whether it's your responsibility or not. Number 5, act like an ant, which is simply achieve the goals that you want to achieve and you believe God wants you to achieve through small steps. Break it down into small steps. Number 6, hate well, which is protect what is good with a healthy intolerance or a healthy hatred of what is evil and wrong. And number 7, don't play fair, where we are called to, instead of always responding people with equal justice, we need to live out the kingdom way of Christ, which is we respond with grace and mercy and truth and forgiveness. Well, that brings us to number 8 in our wise way of living. And again, I just want to remind you that we've been using Henry Cloud's book entitled 9 Things You Simply Must Do to Succeed and Love in Life as a sort of our guiding outline for this series. But we've been trying as well to really bring a biblical perspective as well with Henry Cloud's book. Well, that brings us now to number 8. And our number 8 wise way of living is this: be humble. Be humble. Now, I want to begin this idea about being humble with a story that I think tells us a sort of a negative aspect when we're not humble and what can happen to us, where we can end up missing what's really important because we're not humble. So here's the story. Every once in a while, there'll be a court case that captures the attention of everyone. That is not a recent phenomenon. It's actually been going on for a long time. There was a case like this in the 1840s in the United States of America. It was based in Chicago, which was then sort of the western frontier. It was called the Reaper case. It was based off of Cyrus McCormick, who had invented a certain kind of farm machinery, and it was patent law. This was a rather obscure case, but for cultural reasons at the time, it captured the attention of the American public. It was so important, it was one of those court cases where the legal rock stars of the day lined up against each other, for and against, on this case. Now, normally, these legal rock stars would gather along the East Coast because they were primarily educated in the Ivy League schools at the time. But they had come all the way west to Chicago to try the case, and these lawyers knew that the judge was a Chicago judge. He was a Midwestern judge. So they said, we need a sort of a Midwestern insider. So they worked their networks, and they found this rather obscure small-town lawyer who had worked with this Chicago judge before. And they invited him to come up to Chicago to be part of the court case. Well, they all came in with their trunks and their Ivy League degrees and their erudite abilities. And when they met this small town lawyer that would be part of their team, they were absolutely mortified. He was ill-kept. He was poorly dressed. He had a really strong accent. And he consistently used vernacular of folksy phrases that for them was very off-putting. They thought that if he's involved with the case, there was only going to be one outcome to the case. They were going to lose it. So one of the leading lawyers, a man by the name of Edwin Stanton, said, and he did this so the small town lawyer could hear him, "Let's do away with this ape." Well, they then did what any immature men would do. They ditched him. They would have meals without him. They would tell him different times for the court case to be tried, and then they would get there earlier, and the court case would be going on when he would show up. And they viewed him as someone of very significant insignificance, someone who was beneath them, someone that they could not learn from. Well, Edwin Stanton, along with his other team of lawyers, did win the case. In fact, Edwin Stanton went on to become one of the leading lights in the American legal profession and politics of his day. As a matter of fact, he was invited to become the Secretary of War during the Civil War of the United States. But much to his shock, when he went to work for the one called the President of the United States, he discovered it was the very same person he had called years earlier the ape, because it was Abraham Lincoln, whose incredible significance was not known until the very last years of his life. Now, I tell you this story not so much to talk about Abraham Lincoln, but to reflect on the pride of this lawyer by the name of Edwin Stanton. Because he did not practice humility, he missed so much. He missed out on working with what would become one of the greatest historical figures in American history. You know, it's interesting that King David, in writing the Psalms, uses a phrase in Psalm 36 in which he says, "in their blind conceit." You know, when we don't practice humility on the negative side, we end up missing so much. You know, being humble is, as I said, the eighth way of living. And there is a call by God throughout scriptures to live humbly. I mean, I think of when God spoke through the prophet Micah. He says, what do we require of you but to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God? Well, as I think about the call to humility throughout scriptures, I want to turn your attention to the core passage today found in your outline. It's found in 1 Peter 5, verses 5 and 6, where the apostle makes this call to the churches that he's writing to. He says, "Dress yourselves in humility as you relate to one another. For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So humble yourselves under the mighty power of God, and at the right time, he will lift you up in honor." You know, the call to humility is one where we give up this need of thinking and behaving that we need to be more than we really are. Did you catch that? The need to be more than we really are is in a sense the opposite of being humble. You know, think about the word humility just for a moment. If you do an etymological study of this word, which you're studying the root meaning of the word, it simply comes from the word humus, meaning earth, and also from the Greek word that means on the ground. So think about this. If you're a humble person, you're an earthy person. If you take that idea a little bit further, it means that there's a lot of good company to be had when we're willing to acknowledge that we tread the common soil of life like the rest of the human race. We all have dirt in our shoes. And the wise person has no need to be more than he or she truly is. We all walk on the low point of life called the common ground. That's the beginning of humility. You know, according to Henry Cloud in his book that we've referenced, he says that psychologists will talk about people who have this sickness of trying to preserve the good self. They try to preserve a view that they are all good, either in their own minds or in the eyes of others. And people like this who are committed to this foolish investment in preserving the good self, which another way to describe is a false self, often display defensiveness when corrected. King Solomon in the wisdom literature made these observations. He says, "Whoever corrects a mocker invites insult. Whoever rebukes a wicked man incurs abuse." He also went on to say, "A mocker resents correction, and he will not consult the wise." You know, the whole idea, again, is that if I'm going to practice humility, I have to let go of this need to keep projecting this good self in front of everyone, as though my whole identity, my sense of self-worth depends upon it. You know, I want to go back to Peter's words about dressing ourselves with humility. Why should we put on such a garment? I believe it starts with our understanding of the gospel. One of the most honest prayers we can ever pray is the one that Jesus spoke of in the story of the publican who came into worship in the temple, who simply prayed, "God, have mercy on me, a sinner." You know, some theologians say that that's the most honest prayer anybody can pray, whether you even believe in God or not. You know, and again, we think about that story that Jesus told because he said the publican and prayed that prayer, but the religious leader, the Pharisee, prayed a much different prayer. He prayed a prayer where he was vaunting his good self before God, which was, again, that false self. Because his prayer was, "God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, like robbers and evildoers and adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give a tenth of all I get." You know, dressing ourselves with humility starts with that constant gaze on the gospel about what Christ did for us. Paul says in Romans 5:8, "While we were still sinners, Christ died for us." I mean, what's that Tim Keller quote? The one I like to say all the time. The gospel is this: we're more sinful and flawed in ourselves than we ever dared believe. Yet at the very same time, we're more loved and accepted in Jesus Christ than we ever dared hope. I think we like the second part of that quote, but we also have to embrace the hardness and the truthfulness of the first part, that we're more sinful and flawed in ourselves than we ever dared believe. I mean, if we're really going to put on the garment of humility, it's meaning that we're having a profound awareness that God sees us as we really are. There's no pretense. We can't hide. We have to stop pretending that we are more than we really are, because we are willing to finally just admit our brokenness in the face of God's holiness. We're willing to acknowledge that He has a complete knowledge of us. But we also know that we have a hopeful confidence of God's grace and love for us. I mean, think about this. God's grace saved us. What does Paul say in Ephesians 2:9? "Salvation is not a reward for the good things we've done, so none of us can boast about it." We can't be filled with pride. We have to actually again say it's only by God's grace. And that's again a garment of humility statement. See, our relationship is not one of pride, but of humble dependence on God. I mean, think of Jesus himself when he says, "Learn of my way." He says, "Learn of me, because I am meek and humble of heart, and you shall find rest for your souls." I mean, Jesus is saying that we can stop wearing out our souls by constantly defending and promoting a false self that we think everybody else wants to see. There's a weariness from sustaining self-significance, as Stuart Rush says. Never lose sight that without humility, experiencing God's salvation is impossible. What does Peter say here? God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. The theological scholar of the Middle Ages, St. Thomas Aquinas, described how humility is actually the first virtue we need to acquire because it removes all the obstacles to faith in God. Humility removes pride in that sense of I can't admit my weaknesses. I can't admit my failures before God. I can't admit my brokenness. See, but humility removes all that and makes a person subject to and fit recipient for God's grace. Now, as we were looking at this core passage from Peter as he's writing to the church about dressing ourselves in humility because God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble, look at that next phrase in this passage where he says, so humble yourselves under the mighty power of God, and the right time he'll lift you up in honor. I mean, think about what do we mean by the mighty power of God, or in some translations, it's put the mighty hand of God. You know, some preachers have interpreted this stern phrase to mean it's under the mighty fist of God, so God is going to pound us. But that's not what it means. In Scripture, the mighty power of God symbolizes the deliverance of God. This is how he delivered people out of Egypt. It was through his mighty power, under his mighty hand. You know, Peter is what really saying is this: humble yourself under God's power, under God's protection, under God's deliverance. And we can start to live out this faith of being humble before God and before others because I finally understand that the power comes from God. It doesn't come from you or me. Well, in the time that remains, I just want to sort of take a moment and unpack, well then, how does being humble work itself out in concrete ways in our life? How do we practice it in real time, this wisdom of being humble? Because, again, it's so easy to say it like, in fact, it's easy to go, I'm really proud of being humble. And then we've kind of lost the whole point of it. See, I think being humble really shows itself in real concrete ways. So let's just think these ones through. The first way, if you're going to be humble, means that you're going to be honest about your weaknesses. You know, if you're going to go into a job, a good interviewer will not simply ask you, tell us your strengths, tell us about your victories, tell us about your successes at your work, tell us about all the good qualities and abilities that you can offer us. I think those are good questions. I think a person should be able to articulate that in a job interview. But a good job interviewer will also say, now take a moment and think about your worst mistake in your last job. What was your biggest mistake? What was your biggest failure? What was the one time where you really blew it and you affected your work negatively, you affected your fellow employers negatively? What did you learn from it? Tell us your biggest mistake. Do you have the ability to do that? I guarantee you call up your fellow employers from your past job, they will have no problem sharing that. But that is that ability where you can be honest about your weaknesses. And you can be honest about those struggles that you have. You know, can I also encourage you that if you're going to be honest about your weakness, you can say this phrase at appropriate times. I need help. You can just say it. You don't always say, no, I got it under control. No, I'm good. No, I'm great. No problem. No, you just come in to a person, a fellow worker, a friend, and there's times you just honestly say, you know what? I'm struggling here. I need help. Practice that. That's the first concrete way of being humble. Be honest about your weakness. Here's a second way. Declare your ignorance. So here's, again, a short little phrase that you can practice saying besides the one I just said earlier here, which was, I need help. Here's another one. I don't know. You know, it's funny. That's a tough one, especially when guys are driving in a new place and someone says, do you know where you're going? It's very hard for them to say, I don't know. Well, that again is a demonstration of humility when you can say that phrase in a genuine way. You know, if you're reading the book by Henry Cloud, he has a great opening story in this chapter about someone who was willing to admit that he didn't know. He was a business person who wanted to start a detergent business in China, and he realized he needed to understand the culture around how people did their laundry and washing in China as opposed to other cultures. And the way he figured out how to do this was he was willing to go for a period of time, for a number of weeks, I think, or even a number of months, and he worked on a rice farm. And here was this top-end business guy who could have sent in other people, but he himself went and worked on a rice farm. And while he worked on the rice farm, he figured out what people wanted when it came to washing their clothes. They wanted soft water, apparently. And it meant that there was only a few places that could could have soft water to make lots of bubbles for the soap they presently had. So he took all that knowledge, and he went back to his company, he went back to their research lab, and they were able to create detergent with hard water to make all those same bubbles. And out of that, he actually generated, apparently according to Henry Cloud, $1 billion detergent business and working in China. But it all began with him as a business person saying, I don't know, and humble himself, go in and learn. It's interesting that often when you say, I don't know, it will give you an edge over people who think they know, but they don't. You know, again, it's a terrible sickness when people who think they know and have it all together, and yet it's apparent to everybody else that they don't even know that they don't have it all together and they don't know. But again, can you declare your ignorance? Can you say, I don't know? You know, the third practical way that we can practice being humble in real time is you need to be able to embrace your failures. Embrace your failures. Where I have to be able to say at some point, I was wrong. I messed up. I am sorry. Again, those are good little small phrases to practice to really take on this quality of humility. Can you say, I was wrong? I really didn't pay attention to all the details there. I made a mistake, and I'm sorry because of it. You know, when you are humble, you're willing to accept your failure and mistakes. And in fact, as Henry Cloud says, and even see them as part of the process itself. Cloud goes on to say, self-confidence comes from accepting flaws and mistakes and realizing you can go forward and grow past them and that you can learn from them. See, in fact, I would want to add, you can learn in the midst of your failures and mistakes. And what you can really learn and grow in is to realize my identity is not rooted in my accomplishments. My identity is rooted in God's grace and that God's going to work things out. And he's going to even take my failures and mistakes and help me grow in my faith because of it, and grow in my life and grow in my abilities. You know, people who win in life do not condemn themselves for failure. They accept it. They learn from it. They understand, again, that the common soil of life, remember that humus stuff, includes failure, includes brokenness, includes mess. And instead of beating themselves up for it and believing they cannot accomplish something just because they failed, instead they say, you know what, this is just part of being part of the human race. They humble themselves, they identify with everyone else, and they see failure as part of the journey of life and of faith. So again, if you can embrace your failures, if you can embrace it, and instead of allowing yourself to be disqualified by your failures, but instead embrace it and say, God, what is it that I need to learn in this moment? God, how do I need to depend more on you? God, how can I just need to receive your grace right now, and then I need to move on. This will have a monumental impact on your life. So many people cannot embrace their failures, and by not being able to do that, they're actually saying, I can't be humble. But when you embrace your failures, you're saying, hey, welcome to humility. Just two more. I think practically speaking, if we're going to practice being humble, this eighth wise way of living is we're going to finally start to identify with others. You know, it's interesting that I was reading an article somewhere on the internet, and they talked about a way to make a good first impression. And they talked about 10 different ways. And I wish I could cite all the 10 right now, but there was one that really caught my attention. And that is, if you want to make a good first impression with people, regardless if you perceive this person to be below you or not, you will still truly pay attention to them. And it's interesting that often I will find when I'll watch other people, and when somebody really important comes in, and to be truthful, I know I find myself doing this. If someone comes in that I think is important, is popular, has power of some kind, is well known, I give them my full attention. But then if I perceive someone coming in who really is not of the same level as me, not the same education as me, maybe he's younger than me, maybe it's a child, maybe it's someone who is not of the same economic status as me. If I'm not careful, I find that I can look over them. I can ignore them. I can dismiss them. And what this person was simply saying is, if you really want to make a good first impression with everyone, is you value and appreciate everybody, regardless of whether they're way up on the scale of people or in our cultural scale of maybe being unimportant. I mean, humble people identify with everyone else. They identify with their own failures, and by extension, they then identify with other people who are going through their failures and struggles. And they're willing in those moments to, instead of showing judgment and condemnation, they show other people kindness and understanding, and are even willing to help others who are struggling in their own situation. You identify with others. I want to end on one final way to practice being humble. And here's a phrase that kind of is a little different from all the other ones. The other ones are a little more, have always been a little more functional. But this one is celebrate the small. If you're going to practice being humble, celebrate the small. I think about what Jesus invites us to do in his kingdom. He says, give a cup of cold water in my name. He looked at the woman who brought the 2 little pennies or mites to the temple and said, she gave more than everybody else. I think about him taking the little boy's 5 loaves and 2 fishes and blessing it and feeding thousands with it. But he started with just such a little tiny offering. I mean, the point is that so often I think we want to do what's big and huge. Jesus just invites us to do the small. And I want to finish by reading you another story. It's by a great Christian thinker of the 20th century by the name of C.S. Lewis, one of my favorite authors. He wrote a story about a man that goes to heaven, and he has this angelic host that takes him around, and they're swinging around heaven. And at one moment in this story, he sees this beautiful parade, and at the foot of the parade is this glorious, beautiful, regal woman. And he thinks, oh, is that a queen? Is that a monarch? And his angelic host says, no, not at all. It's someone you've never heard of. Her name was Sarah Smith, and she lives in the suburbs. Well, she seems to be a person of particular importance. And the host says, oh, yes, she's one of the great ones. You've heard that theme in your country. Earth and fame in heaven are 2 quite different things, right? Well, the man honestly said he hadn't heard that. He says, well, who are all these young men and young women at her side? And the host responded, they're her sons and daughters. Oh, she must have had a very large family. No, the host said, every young man or boy that came to her back door with a package of delivery became her son. And every girl that she met was her daughter. Now, Stuart Rutch, preaching this message about smallness and greatness in God's kingdom, went on to say this from that story. He said, don't be deceived that your life is small. Don't be deceived into thinking that you should spend it in self-sustained significance, which is wearisome to our souls. At the end, those whose lives, Rutch says, that are given and lived in Jesus will lead a procession of such beauty and glory, you'd think they were monarchs. Remember what Peter said in the passage we were looking at today? As we humble ourselves under God's mighty power, in due time, he will honor us. He will lift us up. So here's the 8th way to live. Be humble. Let go of the need to be more than you really are. Walk in God's grace and God's power. Embrace your weakness. Celebrate the small. Be willing to identify with others. God bless you.